Have you ever felt it? That cold spot in a perfectly warm room. That flicker of movement in the corner of your eye that vanishes the second you turn your head. That sudden gut-deep certainty that you are not alone, even when you are the only soul for miles. Most people brush these moments aside. A draft, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. They rationalize. They forget. They have to, because the alternative is too terrifying to consider. The alternative suggests that the world we think we know, the solid, predictable reality we build our lives upon, is a lie. It suggests that reality is thin in places, worn like old fabric, and that sometimes things can slip through the cracks. I seek out these cracks. I collect the stories of those who have fallen through them. These are not campfire tales of ghostly apparitions or bumps in the night. These are accounts of reality itself, unraveling, of waking up in a world that is almost, but not quite, the one you fell asleep in. I'm going to share some of these accounts with you now, but I must warn you, once you learn to see the seams, you can't unsee them. You will start to notice the little inconsistencies in your own life, the misplaced keys that reappear in an impossible place, the conversation you swear you never had, the uncanny feeling that the person you know best has been replaced by a perfect stranger. And you will be forced to ask yourself the one question that will haunt you for the rest of your days. Am I going crazy, or is the world? Let's begin our journey in the bruised, forgotten heart of the Appalachian Mountains, in a place called Silence Creek. It was a coal town. Once, before the vein ran dry and the company packed up, taking the town's name off the maps and its soul straight to the grave. It's a place where the trees grow too close together, their branches weaving a canopy so thick that even at high noon, the forest floor is bathed in a perpetual twilight. The air there is heavy, still, and carries the scent of damp earth, rotting leaves, and something else, something ancient and patient. 4 college students, amateur historians, and urban explorers thought they had found the perfect weekend getaway. They were looking for ghosts for a thrill. They found something so much worse. Their story begins, as so many do, with a sense of adventure, a feeling of invincibility that only the young possess. They'd read the scant legends online, tales of strange lights on the mountain, whispers of a secluded community that practiced old, dark traditions long after the town was abandoned. Folk nonsense, they called it, perfect fodder for their burgeoning YouTube channel. Their names were Liam, the confident leader with the camera; Chloe, the skeptic and researcher, armed with historical maps and a cynical wit; Maya, the sensitive one, the artist who claimed to feel the energy of a place; and Ben, the quiet, sturdy friend who was just along for the ride. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sky the color of a faded bruise. The road into Silence Creek wasn't on any GPS. It was a barely there dirt track, a scar on the mountainside that threatened to reclaim their small SUV with every rut and jagged stone. When they finally broke through the tree line into what was once the town's main street, an unnerving quiet fell over them. The buildings were skeletal remains, hollowed-out husks surrendering to a century of neglect. A general store with a caved-in roof, a row of miners' shacks slumping into the earth, and at the far end, the stark, gothic silhouette of a stone church, its steeple clawing at the sky like a desperate hand. It was Maya who felt it first. A pressure in the air, a weight on her chest. She said it felt like walking into a room right after a terrible argument, the silence thick with unspoken rage. Liam, ever the showman, just laughed it off, panning his camera across the decay. "Perfect," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Pure, unadulterated creep factor. The subscribers are going to eat this up. Chloe consulted her maps, pointing toward a trail leading up the mountain behind the church. According to the county surveyor's map from 1890, there was a small, self-sufficient homestead up that way. Belonged to a preacher named Silas Kane. He was controversial. Split from the main church. They called his followers the Children of the Lonesome Creek. As they began the hike, the feeling of being watched was immediate and oppressive. It wasn't the feeling of a deer in the woods or a bird in the trees. This was intelligent. Malevolent. Ben, who had been silent for most of the trip, kept glancing back down the trail, his brow furrowed. The trail itself was strange. It was far too clear, too well trodden for a place that had been abandoned for 100 years. As they climbed higher, they started noticing them. Small, strange symbols carved into the trees. Not initials or lovers' hearts, but intricate geometric patterns that seemed to hurt the eyes to look at directly. And then there were the dolls, hanging from low branches, swaying gently in a non-existent breeze. They were made of corn husks, twigs, and scraps of faded cloth, their faces blank, featureless voids. Maya refused to get close to them, her hand flying to the silver pendant she wore around her neck. Liam, however, was ecstatic, filming each one with macabre glee. "This is gold," he whispered to the lens. "Freakin' Blair Witch vibes." The homestead was just as the map foretold, a clearing where the trees inexplicably refused to grow. The ground was flat and strangely barren. All that remained of the cabin was a foundation of moss-covered stones and a massive, crumbling chimney that looked like a jagged black tooth. The air here was colder, the silence deeper. As Chloe and Liam explored the foundation, Maya and Ben were drawn to the edge of the clearing. There, tucked under the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, was a small stone-lined well covered by a heavy, rotted wooden lid. It was Ben who lifted the lid. The smell that billowed out was nauseating, a thick, coppery stench of decay. They peered inside. It wasn't a water well. It was filled, almost to the brim, with more of the cornhusk dolls. Hundreds of them. And woven into each doll, tied with strands of what looked disturbingly like human hair, were small, yellowed animal bones. But that wasn't the worst part. Lying atop the pile, starkly different from the others, was a newer doll. It was larger, made of fresh husks, and it was wearing a tiny, torn piece of blue denim that was identical to the patch on Ben's own jeans. A cold dread, far beyond any manufactured thrill, washed over them. This wasn't a historical remnant. This was active. They were backing away from the well when Liam shouted from the cabin's foundation. "Guys, you've got to see this!" He was pointing his camera down into a dark hole in the center of the stone footprint. A root cellar. The wooden door had long since rotted away, leaving a gaping maw. Against their better judgment, driven by a morbid curiosity that would seal their fate, they clicked on their flashlights and descended the rickety stone steps. The cellar was small, damp, and smelled of wet earth and something else. Something cloyingly sweet like overripe fruit. The beams of their flashlights danced across the stone walls, revealing more of the strange symbols etched into the rock. And in the center of the room, on a flat-topped stone that looked unnervingly like an altar, was a thick, leather-bound book. It was the preacher's journal. Chloe, her skepticism finally failing her, reached out and opened it. The pages were filled with a spidery, frantic script. It wasn't just a diary. It was a testament of madness. Preacher Silas Kane hadn't just split from the church. He believed he had been called by an older, darker power that dwelt within the mountain itself. He wrote of whispers in the wind, of a presence that demanded sacrifice, of a door that could be opened. He detailed rituals, chants, and offerings made to appease this entity. But the entries grew more and more unhinged. He wrote of his congregation dwindling, of people fleeing in the night. He wrote of a hunger that the entity had, a hunger that small animals could no longer satisfy. The final entries were almost illegible, stained with dark, rusty splotches. He spoke of the lonesome children, the ones who stayed, the ones who were truly faithful. He wrote about creating the dolls as vessels, as anchors. The very last page contained a single chilling sentence, written in a hand that shook with either ecstasy or terror. "We will not be forgotten. We will wait inside the trees and watch. We will be the silence in the creek." It was as Chloe read that last line aloud that the heavy stone slab at the top of the cellar stairs scraped shut, plunging them into absolute suffocating darkness. Panic erupted. Liam's camera clattered to the floor. Their flashlight beams sliced wildly through the pitch black, illuminating nothing but their own terrified faces. They scrambled up the stairs, pushing against the stone, but it was immovable, as if the mountain itself was holding it down. And then from the other side of the stone, they heard it. Not a human voice. It was a low, guttural chanting. The words were ancient, alien. yet somehow they resonated deep in their bones, vibrating with a power that made their teeth ache. Interspersed with the chanting was another sound, the high giggling laughter of a child. It echoed all around them, seeming to come from the very stones of the cellar. They were trapped. Hours bled into one another. Their flashlights began to flicker and die one by one. The chanting outside never ceased, a constant maddening drone. In the dwindling light, their fear began to turn on itself. Accusations flew. Chloe blamed Liam for his obsession with the channel. Liam accused Maya of somehow attracting this with her talk of bad energy. Maya, sobbing in a corner, just kept whispering, "The dolls! They're watching us from the walls." Ben was the first to see it. In the last dying beam of his flashlight, he pointed a shaking finger at the far wall. One of the symbols carved into the stone was glowing with a faint, sickly green light. As they all stared, mesmerized, the stone around the symbol began to shift, to crumble. A small, dark opening was forming. It wasn't an escape. It was an entrance. The giggling was closer now, coming from that new darkness. A small shape began to emerge. It looked like a child, pale and gaunt, with long, dark hair. Its eyes were black, empty pits. It wore a simple, homespun dress, the kind a pioneer child might have worn. It wasn't just one. More openings appeared. More of the lonesome children crawled out from the mountain's heart. They moved with an unnatural, jerky gait, their small hands tipped with long, yellowed nails. They didn't speak. They just stared, their heads cocked with a bird-like curiosity. And they began to close in. The last thing Liam's camera recorded before the battery gave out was the sound of screaming. Not the thrill-seeking yells of college kids playing Ghost Hunter. The raw, primal screams of prey. The official story is that 4 students went missing during a hiking trip in a remote, unmarked area of the Appalachian Mountains. Their vehicle was found abandoned. Despite extensive searches, no trace of them was ever discovered. But I know what happened. Because a year later, a different group of urban explorers, drawn by the same dark legends, found their way to Silence Creek. They found the crumbling church, the hanging dolls. They found the cellar, the stone slab still firmly in place. And sitting on that slab, placed neatly in a row, were 4 new cornhusk dolls, each one dressed in a tiny scrap of modern clothing, a piece of a North Face jacket, a swatch of flannel, a torn shred of a band t-shirt, and a small, cracked camera lens tied with a shoelace. Some places don't want to be found. And some things never ever want to let you go. The fear of a haunted place is one thing. The spirits of the dead, however malevolent, are at least bound by certain rules. They are echoes of what once was. But what do you do when the monster isn't a ghost? What do you do when it's flesh and blood, living right next door, watching you from behind the curtains of a perfectly normal-looking house? What do you do when the evil is human? This next account comes from a woman named Sarah, who believed she had finally escaped the noise and chaos of the city for a peaceful life in the country. She bought a small, isolated farmhouse in rural Ohio, miles from her nearest neighbor, or so she thought. There was one other house visible from her property, about a half-mile down the dirt road, a dilapidated salt box structure that seemed to be slowly collapsing into the overgrown fields around it. The locals in the nearest town, a sleepy collection of shops and a single blinking traffic light, had warned her about it. They spoke in hushed tones about the man who lived there. Old Man Hemlock, they called him. No one knew his real name. He'd lived in that house for 50 years, ever since his family had disappeared. One night they were there. The next they were gone. No bodies, no note, no explanation. Hemlock stayed. He never came to town. He never spoke to anyone. He just existed, a local boogeyman to scare the children. Sarah dismissed it as small-town gossip, the kind of folklore that springs up around any recluse. For the first few months, life was idyllic. She enjoyed the solitude, the quiet rhythm of the countryside. She rarely saw any sign of life from the Hemlock place, save for the occasional plume of wood smoke from his chimney on a cold morning. She felt safe. The feeling didn't last. It started subtly. A single, perfect dead crow left on her front porch. She assumed it was a gift from her cat. A few days later, another one. Then a dead squirrel. Then a rabbit. Always placed perfectly in the center of the doormat, like a formal offering. A chill started to creep into her peaceful solitude. She began to notice things. The way the corn stalks in the field that separated their properties were sometimes trampled, forming a faint path leading directly towards her house, a path that hadn't been there before. At night, she'd sit on her porch and stare at his house, a single pale yellow light glowing in one window. And sometimes, she would see a silhouette pass in front of it, watching. The real terror began one night during a thunderstorm. The power went out, plunging her house into a thick, inky blackness. She was huddled in her living room, lit by a single candle, when she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping on her window. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the rain. This was deliberate. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She crept to the window, peering out into the stormy darkness. In the brief, brilliant flash of a lightning strike, she saw him. He was standing at the edge of her lawn, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. Old Man Hemlock. He was tall and gaunt, his face a mess of deep-set wrinkles and a tangled gray beard. He was staring right at her, and he was holding something. A long, thin object. As another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, she realized with a wave of nausea what it was. A single long-stemmed wilted rose. When the thunder crashed, he was gone. She didn't sleep that night. She sat with her back against the front door, a fireplace poker clutched in her white-knuckled hands, listening to the sounds of the storm and imagining every creak and groan of the old house was him trying to get in. The next morning, tucked under her windshield wiper, was the wilted rose. After that, the gifts became more frequent and more disturbing. Bundles of dried herbs tied with black string, small polished animal skulls, a child's worn leather shoe. Each one was a violation, a message that he could get close to her whenever he wanted, that her locks and her solitude were no protection at all. She called the sheriff, a weary man with a kind face and a skeptical sigh. He paid a visit to Hemlock. When he returned, he told Sarah there was nothing he could do. The old man was strange, he admitted, but he hadn't broken any laws. He claimed the items were just neighborly gifts, offerings of goodwill. There were no threats. There was no crime. He's just a lonely old coot, the sheriff said, but his eyes told her he didn't fully believe it himself. Just ignore him. He'll get bored. But he didn't get bored. He got bolder. She started hearing noises at night. Not just tapping, but scraping sounds from under the house, as if something was digging. She'd wake up in the morning to find fresh soil piled near her foundation. She began to feel like a prisoner in her own home, her idyllic retreat transformed into a cage. She took to sleeping in a chair in the living room, facing the windows, a shotgun resting across her lap. She was exhausted, living on a knife's edge of constant fear. The breaking point came on a cold, moonless October night. She was jolted awake by a sound from her kitchen, a floorboard creaking. Not outside, inside. Someone was in her house. Her blood ran cold. She couldn't breathe. Every horror movie cliché she'd ever rolled her eyes at was now her reality. Don't hide in a closet. Don't run upstairs. She silently lifted the shotgun, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold it steady. She crept towards the kitchen doorway, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She peered around the frame. The room was dark, but the faint moonlight filtering through the window revealed a figure standing by her kitchen table. It was Hemlock. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He was just standing there, his back to her, gently touching the back of one of her chairs, almost caressing it. A low humming sound emanated from his chest. Rage, born of weeks of terror, overwhelmed her fear. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice cracking. He turned slowly. His face, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was not angry. It was filled with a profound, soul-deep sadness. "I'm sorry," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I miss them." He took a shuffling step towards her. "You look so much like her." "My Eleanor." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't come any closer." "The house gets so lonely," he continued, his eyes pleading. "They shouldn't have left. They're in the walls. They whisper to me. They told me you could be the new mother. You could make the house a home again." He took another step, his hand outstretched. "We could be a family." That was when she saw that the back door was wide open, its lock expertly and silently broken. That was when she realized the scraping sounds hadn't been him trying to get in. He had already been in. He had been digging a new place for her under the floorboards. The shotgun blast was deafening in the small house. It threw him backwards, and he collapsed in a heap on the floor. Sarah stood there shaking, the smell of gunpowder stinging her nostrils, her ears ringing. It was over. But when the sheriff and his deputies arrived, they found more than just old man Hemlock's body. An investigation of his dilapidated house uncovered a hidden room in the cellar, its door concealed behind a false wall. Inside, they found them, his family, his wife, Eleanor, and their 2 small children. They weren't buried. They were sitting in chairs around a small table, perfectly preserved, mummified by the cold, dry air of the cellar. They were dressed in their Sunday best, their empty eye sockets staring blankly into the darkness. They had been there for 50 years. Hemlock hadn't killed them. The coroner's report on the bodies, long since cold cases, showed they had died of Spanish influenza during a small, localized outbreak that had swept through the area decades ago. He just couldn't let them go. The gifts he left for Sarah, the herbs, the skulls, they were folk remedies, pathetic attempts to ward off the sickness that he thought she, his new Eleanor, might catch. The scraping under the house? He was making her a root cellar, to keep her safe and cool, to keep her from spoiling like the first family did. He wasn't a monster in the way she thought. He was something far more tragic and perhaps more terrifying. A man so shattered by grief that his love had twisted into a monstrous, delusional obsession. Sarah sold the farm. She moved back to the city, to a high-rise apartment with a doorman and 100 locks on the door. But she never felt safe, because she learned the most frightening lesson of all. Sometimes the creak on the floorboards isn't a ghost. Sometimes the monster isn't a stranger in the dark, but a neighbor driven by a love so powerful it rots into madness. And sometimes there is no escape, because the horror isn't just in the house. It's in the inescapable, lonely grief of the human heart. Now we venture from the horrors we can see and touch to something far more insidious, a horror that doesn't break down your door, but rewrites the very code of your existence. This final account is the one that keeps me up at night. It's the story of a man named Thomas, a traveling salesman who spent his life on the road, existing in a world of anonymous motels, roadside diners, and the endless, hypnotic stretch of the American highway. He was on a cross-country trip driving through the vast, empty expanse of Nevada. The sun had set, painting the desert sky in shades of blood orange and violet. He was tired, his eyes gritty from a long day of driving. He saw a pinprick of light in the distance, a flickering neon sign that promised a soft bed and a quiet night. The sign simply read, Motel. Not the Starlight Motel or the Oasis Inn, just Motel. It was a squat, L-shaped building, painted a faded shade of desert sand. It looked like 1,000 other motels he had stayed in over the years. He checked in. The man behind the counter was nondescript with a face that was instantly forgettable. Thomas got his key, a real metal key for room 7, and trudged to his door. The room was clean, sparse. A bed with a brown chenille spread, a small wooden desk, a television bolted to the wall. Everything was normal. He showered, watched some television, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. He woke up the next morning feeling refreshed. He gathered his things, packed his car, and dropped the key in the slot at the front office. He drove away as the sun was rising, the motel shrinking in his rearview mirror. He drove for about an hour before he stopped for breakfast at a diner. He ordered coffee and pancakes. It was as he was sipping his coffee that he first noticed something was wrong. His coffee mug was a slightly different shade of white than he was used to. Not bright white, but an almost imperceptible off-white, the color of old bone. He dismissed it. A trick of the diner's lighting. Then he looked at the salt shaker. It had 3 holes on the top. He distinctly remembered that salt shakers always had 2 holes, and pepper shakers had 3. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He shook his head, trying to clear it. He was just tired. Road fatigue. It happens. He paid his bill and got back on the road. But the feeling of wrongness grew. The green on the highway signs was a shade too dark. More of a forest green than the bright, familiar Kelly green. The font used for the town names seemed subtly different. The letters thinner, more elongated. He turned on the radio. The songs were familiar but not quite right. A famous Beatles song had a different guitar solo. A well-known Johnny Cash tune had an extra verse he'd never heard before. It was like listening to a cover band that was exceptionally good, but not perfect. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He told himself he was having some sort of mild anxiety attack, maybe even a stroke. He pulled over at a rest stop and looked at himself in the mirror. It was his face. Same tired eyes, same receding hairline, but was that a scar above his left eyebrow? He was certain he'd never had a scar there. He touched it. The skin was puckered and old. He frantically pulled out his wallet to look at his driver's license. The picture was him. But in the photo, he had the scar. The birth date was correct. The name was correct. But the issuing state was different. It said he was from North Carolina. He had lived his entire life in Ohio. Panic, cold, and sharp seized him. He fumbled for his phone to call his wife, Maria. He dialed the number he had known by heart for 20 years. A man answered. "Hello? Who is this?" Thomas stammered. "Where's Maria?" "I think you have the wrong number, buddy," the man said, and hung up. He tried again. Same man. He tried calling his brother. The number was disconnected. His parents. Disconnected. His best friend. A screeching fax machine tone. It was as if his entire world, his entire web of connections, had been systematically unplugged and rewired into something alien. He started driving again, this time with a frantic urgency. He had to get home. He had to see if his house was still there, if his wife was still there. He drove for 2 days straight, fueled by coffee and sheer terror. He finally pulled onto his street, the familiar row of suburban houses that had been his home for 15 years. But it was all wrong. The oak tree on his front lawn was gone, replaced by a weeping willow. The neighbor's house was painted blue, not yellow. And his house had a different colored front door. It was red. His door had always been green. With his heart pounding in his throat, he walked up the path and used his key. It didn't fit in the lock. He knocked, his hand trembling. The door opened. It was Maria, his wife. She looked the same. Same warm smile, same laugh lines around her eyes. But there was a flicker of confusion, of apprehension in her expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but distant, the voice of a stranger. "Maria, it's me. It's Tom," he said, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "I'm sorry," she said, her smile faltering. "I think you're mistaken. My husband's name is David. He'll be home any minute." She started to close the door. In his desperation, he pushed it open, stepping inside. "No, look," he said, pulling out his wallet again. "Look at this picture." He showed her a photo of the two of them on their wedding day. She glanced at it, and a strange, sad look came over her face. "That's a lovely picture," she said softly. "But that's not me." And as he looked closer, he saw it. The woman in the picture was Maria, but her eyes were a different color. In the photo, they were brown. His wife's eyes, the eyes of the woman standing in front of him, were blue. At that moment, a car pulled into the driveway. A man got out. A man who was not him. He walked up to the door and put his arm around Maria, pulling her close. "Is there a problem here, honey?" he asked. The police were called. Thomas tried to explain, but his story sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. He had no ID that matched this world. His credit cards were declined. His social security number didn't exist. To them, he was a dangerously delusional vagrant, trespassing and harassing an innocent woman. He was taken to a psychiatric hospital. He has been there for 10 years now. He spends his days telling his story to anyone who will listen, to doctors who nod patiently and increase his medication, to nurses who offer him kind, pitying smiles. He tells them about the motel with no name. He tells them he believes that when he fell asleep in room 7, he didn't just rest. He slipped sideways. He woke up in a world that was an almost perfect copy of his own, but where every detail was subtly, terrifyingly wrong. A world where he had been replaced, or worse, had never existed at all. He is a ghost in a world that is not his own. Sometimes, late at night, when the hospital is quiet, he looks out the window at the stars. He wonders if, on a nearly identical Earth, spinning in a slightly different dimension, another version of him, a man with blue-eyed wife and a green front door, woke up that morning in room 7 and is now living his life, completely unaware that anything is amiss. And he is haunted by the final, most terrifying question of all. Which one of them is the real Thomas? The stories I've shared tonight are more than just tales of the unexplained. They are warnings. They are glimpses into the fragility of our perceived reality. They remind us that the world is far older, far stranger, and far less understood than we are comfortable believing. They teach us that there are shadows in the corners of our world, both supernatural and deeply human, that can swallow us whole. So the next time you feel that cold spot, or see that flicker of movement, or get that unshakable feeling that the world is just a little bit off, don't be so quick to dismiss it. You might just be looking through one of the cracks, and you never know what might be looking back. If you have a story, an experience that made you question the very fabric of your reality, share it in the comments below. Let us know we're not alone in the dark. And if you want to hear more accounts from the edge of the explainable, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You wouldn't want to miss a thing. Stay safe out there, and whatever you do, try not to fall through the cracks.